Welcome to the first part of our small group studies. This first study is looking at God's purpose for the church. To help us get started, Indy and I have come to the Blue Lake. And this Blue Lake, I've grown up in the area. Blue Lake in the Plenty Gorge, very hard to find. In fact, if you hadn't grown up here, if you hadn't been here before, without a map, impossible. You'd never find it. And discovering God's purpose for the church, really helpful to get a map. So we're going to go down to the Blue Lake and introduce a map. So the thing with maps, trying to find a location, is that when you first go to your map, look for a landmark that you know, and then as a reference point it helps you find the location that you're searching for. This story that we're going to tell and look at gives us those sorts of landmarks, so that when we dig deeper down into the scriptures later on in part 2 of our studies, particularly the New Testament, we've got some good landmarks and we can find what we're looking for. The story that we're going to tell, folks, isn't going to look like this one. No,
You know, so you want to get it right. And wait, you want to make sure you get it as well.
I'm getting all this on film.
Okay.
What's wrong with that story? What's wrong with that? Well, when in through the stone, it just dropped down deep. Our story's not going to look like that. It's going to look a lot more like this one. It's not good. Go on telling this story, just a little red hot tip here. There's very few stones that skip very well at Blue Lake. I know. The poor workman always blames his tools, but I've got to tell you, there's sharp edges here. Anyway, we're skipping stones. We don't want to go deep. We want to knock over the top of just, 3 or 4 key points, key landmarks in the scriptures that suggest God's purpose, ultimately for the church, but his purpose for the whole of creation, really. So, have you got a whiteboard? You got a whiteboard here, mate? Anywhere? And I'll just... No whiteboard. No whiteboard at Blue Lake. All right, look what we'll do. Let's go back to the study. I've got a whiteboard there. We'll just sort of map out this story a little better.
Welcome to Big L's study.
It would have been really, really nice to get the stone to skip 5 times, because that's how many chapters in God's big book I want you to focus on. Just 5 chapters. We're just going to skip across the top of the book. It's a big book, you can see. But just 5 chapters in order to answer the question, what is God's purpose for the church? I'll draw the headings of these chapters up on the whiteboard behind me. This is Big Al's whiteboard. It's not very big, but it is a whiteboard and it will do the job. I want to show you the 5 chapters that we're going to skip through. So first of all, in God's big book, we're going to look at chapter 1, which is creation. 2, Abraham. 3, Israel. Then 4, Jesus. And then 5, the church. This 5th chapter, the church, in part 2 of our studies, that's the part or portion that you guys are going to look at in great depth to discover what the church is being told to do regarding fulfilling God's purposes in the world. But for this study that you guys are doing now, we're looking at these chapters to answer one very important question. What is the purpose of the church? In other words, why did God birth the church? How does that relate to his purposes for the world? So, purposes for the world, that sounds like creation. So we start this one in creation, where God created the world. And we noticed in creation that mankind had this incredibly deep, rich, important relationship with God. God is Trinity, Father, Son and Holy Spirit. So with God, with each other, and with creation itself. We know, though, that God created this wonderful environment, this wonderful relationship. But by the time you bump into chapter 3, the book of Genesis, which talks about creation, we've got this fracture in the relationships. To try and restore things back to how it was in the beginning, first of all, God called Abraham to try and help. However, by the time you've read the story of Abraham, you know, don't you, that Abraham and his descendants end up in slavery in Egypt. So the story's not going too well. Enslaved in Egypt. But Exodus chapter 3, 1 to 21, which you guys are going to be reading, you've probably already been reading in your quiet times from the document. Exodus 3, God hasn't forgotten his people, God hasn't forgotten his plan. So now the baton's passed from an individual, Abraham, to Israel. This nation Israel is born, and Israel is then told by God, called by God to go out and continue to fulfill his purpose in the world. So by the time we get to Jesus, chapter 1, 2, 3, 4, Jesus stands up. You've probably read that in that document that you've downloaded that you can live with in your quiet times for the next week or so. But through the book of Isaiah particularly, and then when Jesus stands up in Luke chapter 4 and reads from Isaiah, it's very, very clear that the baton has been passed from Israel to Jesus. Jesus now is setting about putting all sorts of things right. In other words, restoring things back to how it was in the beginning. Our last chapter of the book, Church, brings us pretty close to the present day. We see Jesus, after his death and his resurrection, Jesus leaves, and he leaves with some instructions, the Great Commandment in particular, and the Great Commission. So now, again, it's abundantly clear that Jesus really has tagged the church now to fulfill God's plans and purposes for the world. So the church's role now is to continue what was begun by Abraham, then Israel, Jesus, and now its role is to restore creation, to restore relationships between humanity and God, humanity and creation, relationships with each other, restore those things back to how they were at the very beginning. So, take this. It's not just an academic exercise. As you read through this and are guided by the text that you're going to bump into and some of the sort of descriptive stuff and written stuff that's down here, ask yourself a couple of personal questions as well. Make this meaningful personally. Ask yourself, what is this teaching me about God? What is this teaching me about humanity? What is this teaching me about myself? And then a really important question is, in light of what I've been reading here through God's story, do I need to change some things personally? Now, when you meet in your second Bible study group, small group, to write down the answers to the questions at the back of this, you might want to share some of those sorts of things. Hey, what did I learn about myself? What sorts of things were I confronted with? What sorts of things really encouraged me? Share those sorts of things with each other. We're skipping across the top of God's story, but why don't you share a little bit of your story that you've bumped into in doing these Bible studies? So this is God's story, but in your small group on that second week, share a little bit of your story with each other. Your story as you've encountered it by reading these really important texts related to God's plans and purposes for his church, for his world, for his creation. So I hope you enjoy this. This is part one. This is the conclusion of part one. You've got a couple of weeks to go through this document, and then we'll introduce you to part two, which, remember, is drilling down a lot deeper into that fifth chapter of God's story, the church. And this time, we'll be looking not at the purpose for the church, but what is God's mission for the church? In other words, what is God telling the church to do specifically so that he can achieve these purposes that we've been looking and discovering about in part one of this small group study. So enjoy that, and we'll see you soon.